that if I met, I'm sorry? Oh, you are recording. Okay, wonderful. I think we can agree, or I think that, none of us are really the same person that they were in their youth or early adulthood. We all do grow, we all change. But generally speaking, I think if I met any of you in your 30 or 40-year-old selves, I think I would know who I was speaking to. Um, at least most of you. On the other hand, my decades ago self would have been someone you might not readily feel familiar with. I think this might surprise some people. You'd meet somebody whose persona presented as dramatically different than the Bob version in 220 or 2025 that you've known for so long. Gregarious me wasn't gregarious. I tended to avoid speaking in groups larger than two. I stammered and stuttered, avoided being seen, was very ill at ease socially, had very little self confidence, very self critical. Okay. Kind of a contrast to the guy you know. Um, I was truly someone who, when I contrast it to who I am today, even surprises me. Um, so, what transpired to first shape that person, who very thankfully became the person in front of you right now? I'm somebody who I think is genuinely friendly and outgoing. I like to talk a lot. I'm often accused of talking too much. I like a good laugh. You know me as an active member here, a deacon and an elder. Okay. Um, I'm known as some circles simply as Susan's husband, which is okay. I like that. I'm a family guy. We have 3 children and 4 grandchildren, and I'll show you some pictures if you'd like me to, about whom I happily talk a lot. In my neighborhood, some of you know this, I'm known as the gardener guy because my front yard flower display, um, which I know now is a kind of a reflection of my spiritual growth. They're on a very busy thoroughfare. I get a lot of attention and a lot of appreciation from people. Okay. And while spending a great deal of time planting and digging and raking in my front yard, I very happily chat with numerous folks walking by who can always count on a conversation that might start with my flowers and lead to almost anything. I like to talk. I have a lot to say. My son-in-law, during a party at his house recently, was about to do something like pinning a warning sign on me that said, "Start talking to this guy at risk of your entire evening." Um, but in general, I do lead a life with which I'm very generally contented, and that's because what I've just described is only a very small part of the many, many ways I've been blessed. At the head of that list is, of course, my beloved family, my church family also. But circumscribing and sustaining everything is my continually growing and maturing faith, which, of course, is what I'm here to try to tell you about. The spiritual and therefore emotional growth that's carried me to where I am today, and in fact brought me to be here with you this morning, requires a look at my life journey. A journey whose earlier decades can be best described as having beaten and crushed me into that previous, much older version of me. So, how did I get to this present point in my spiritual life, and how did I reach a point where, to a great extent, it even describes me? How did that person, initially chained to a profoundly difficult past, find his way to the persona you know and who I am monumentally grateful to be today. It gets very personal here. What best describes my early childhood and adolescence is basically turmoil, destruction, dysfunction, and trauma. I'm in my 9th decade. I'm an octogenarian. Don't you love that word? Raise your hand if that fits. Okay. Okay. But even now, my understanding of that so distant past continues to evolve. It doesn't go away. When you're closer in time, one tends not to grasp that damage and trauma, even though it's overwhelming when it happens, you don't realize it's life-changing, but it is. What do you do? And when you're in a circumstance like that, you just go to the next day, the next month, the next event. Okay. Understanding and healing always requires time and distance. And understanding, healing, and awareness of the impact of trauma in childhood happens, but it's slow and it's very incremental. I have 4 siblings, and I now grasp that each of us, because of our birth order, necessarily had different experiences. You know, it's a different format when each kid comes on the scene. Family dynamics change, and they're just different for each child. And also, having taught in an urban high school and simply lived a lot of life, I do understand that my personal experiences are not unique and will often pale in comparison to so many others. But my lived childhood reality can only be described, and it doesn't soften, even with decades between, as one of seemingly perpetual and traumatic dysfunction. Actually, way more than for many years I was able to grasp or understand. And that environment is what shaped the person I inevitably became. It was unavoidable. It was all encompassing. How I saw myself, how I saw the world, my place in it, where I went, with whom I associated, where I worked, how I functioned in relation to my peers, how I did academically, how I saw the adult world and related to it, all was fearfully. And of course, my level of self-confidence, whatever it is that makes the person. I lived life in that world into which I was born, which even today, I have to accept still holds me captive to a certain extent. I inevitably became that dramatically different person that I've described a little bit. So who and what I was an accurate reflection of the familial press that was my daily reality. Life was about mental survival and sometimes physical preservation. And at that point, there was certainly no mental room for spiritual thought or growth. My early years were different than most. If I gave it a title, which I've tried to do, I would call it On Being a Glacial Erratic. Okay, what's a glacial erratic? A glacial erratic is a glacially carried and deposited rock that does not relate geologically and is distant from its area of origin. Okay? And that so well describes my family. My father was born in 1893. He was 50 when I was born. In hindsight, he may as well have been born in 1793. He was a tailor, illiterate, came here to the United States, well, he came to Rochester in 1923 from Lebanon and brought my mother, a high school graduate, 17 years younger, and a 19-year-old in 1929. They landed in October of 1929, which is kind of interesting. Significantly, their identity wasn't Lebanese, it wasn't Syrian or Middle Eastern or Arabic. It was Druze. Anybody ever hear of the Druze? Okay, a couple of people. Okay. So what's that, you ask? Was it a sect? Was it a religion? Was it a tribe? I honestly, truly am not certain even now. Probably a bit of all three. And interestingly, they didn't really know either. But that was the identity that they were born into, and from day one demanded that I and my siblings adopt as well. If I ask what it meant or what it was, the mantra was, that's what we are. That's who and what you are. We're not them, or we're not them. The others are strangers. Okay. There were no other Druze families in Rochester. We were it. Okay. And there's a story behind that, which I can elaborate on if we have a little time. So basically, all a kid wants to do is fit in, and they demanded that we never could or should. So we were totally isolated from that which we theoretically belonged. And in the case of my father, and to a certain extent my mother, their bodies came here, but their minds never made the trip. To make things even more interesting, that little island on which we existed in Rochester, probably a mile from here as the crow flies, but a different universe, we were surrounded mostly by Sicilian Catholics. And they were first and second generation folks like us who made up a kind of transplanted peasant culture. I don't mean that in a pejorative, but they were illiterate for the most part, and tied to the old country in culture, attitude, and religion. Their worldview couldn't have been more different than the one I was planted in. To illustrate a little bit, I had a friend with whom I shared a great many of our urban adventures. I would accompany this friend, Artie, when he went to his mandated confession on Saturday mornings to St. Bridget's Church. And on the way, Artie would often steal a pop or candy bar from the corner deli. And then he'd proceed to St. Bridget's, where he would confess this and his other transgressions to the priest, and therefore be right with God. And he and all of my other street pals knew that if they jumped through that hoop on Saturday morning, their souls were safe. But I, on the other hand, they were sure was in serious trouble. Why? Well, my goodness, I wasn't Catholic, and worse, I was never baptized. Holy smokes. Well, that was my first brush with religion, okay? I knew no other church-going people or anyone who conversed about church or religion. Anything but everyday stuff is all I heard. I knew no Protestants, so the local brand of Southern Sicilian Catholicism is what religion was to me then. To put it mildly, the Enlightenment, nor had the Reformation reached my neighborhood. Okay. Now, how did this all begin? I was born the fifth of 5 children in 5 years. I was born in a house on Baden Street. My birth was never registered. We never got around to that. There was no money. A struggling mother with 5 children from infant me to age 5. Frankly, a crude and very abusive husband and father for whom dominance, control, and hierarchy was everything. And his mind adulated his first 2 born sons, saw his twin daughters as a pair of possessions, and the youngest son as an unwelcome, unintended, never truly acknowledged add-on. I was an oops. The eldest, a son who in the country mindset that they brought with them was the ordained, always out of control, but never corrected firstborn. And in that situation, I now understand was given blanket permission to emotionally and physically abuse, dominate, and denigrate his youngest sibling. And it was relentless. And he was someone now long deceased who I now can only best generously describe as to have been emotionally deformed. Obviously, someone who was an enormous burden in my life. He was loved unconditionally by his parents, but a toxic, emotionally destructive, and relentless predator for me. As time moves on, as time moved along, I did learn in a way to survive, but the milieu of what I now understand as profound abuse never ceased and became to me what was normal. That was my normal world. The rest of the world was abnormal, and where I always felt different, a stranger, and fearful of how visible my differentness might be to people. I came home to what I know now would be best described as an insane asylum every night, and I was one of the inmates. I could regale you with a million descriptions of things that went on, but a good one is when in adolescence, early adolescence, the theme became a wild, never-ending scene of very vile, groundless accusations against my mother and sisters, with literally hundreds of incidents of turmoil, violence, and emotional wreckage. The very young me, 10 to 13, tried to intervene to protect my siblings, and of course, this when a cop going into a disturbance in a family, I became the target. And the visuals of those moments, even through a lifetime, removed from them, still lurk and can often be brought to mind and are still vivid. Any kind of a spiritual awakening was, to put it mildly, at that point, still pending. If God was mentioned, it was only through invective. But life did roll on. I did have an intellect, which I know now preserved me. I graduated from high school, barely, and somehow got accepted at SUNY Brockport, which was in no way an academic bastion then, but all I could truly then handle. And of course, the social dimension, you would understand at this point, was difficult. I graduated and happily took a job teaching middle school in a small town for 2 years. But then I created another pattern. Not surprisingly, though I was, in a way, on my feet for the first time, not at all truly understanding why, I could never shake a sense of not belonging, so decided that this wasn't it. As it turns out, it never was it. So I decided to seek the next step. But just leaving, this was 1967, that wasn't an option, since the draft was lurking, as was the Vietnam War. So I'd always been sort of fascinated by ships, the sea, and the idea of travel. So on a real impulse, I walked into a Navy recruiting office, did surprisingly well on an aptitude test, and in 1967 got accepted into Navy OCS, Officers Candidate School. There I found myself with people from all the Ivies, MIT, Caltech, you name it. 3 of them were graduate lawyers from Duke and Harvard and Brown and you name it. And there was little Bob from SUNY Brockport, a social studies teacher from a middle school social studies teacher. It was an over my head, very physically, academically demanding, mostly engineering regimen. It was a lot for a middle school social studies teacher. And they were graduating 600 people a month from there. That was at the height of the Vietnam War. I was close to being the anchor man in the class of 600. But I did graduate. I made it through after 4 murderous months. Somehow, I did it, and I became an ensign headed for a ship based in San Diego, which, as it happened, was already across the Pacific, where incidentally there was that war going on. I found myself thrust into a seagoing world that ran 24/7. And these were all good things. I didn't know it then, but I was compelled to deal with a lot of complexity, stress, and responsibility, and you weren't allowed any room for error. I quickly became an integral part of the functioning of the ship. I was fortunate in the sense that I was the only new officer, and there was a need to get me qualified to drive the thing, for which I was given, it was more forbidding than it sounds like. I was given many hours of intense practice and instruction. I did become officially certified, seen as competent, and found myself enjoying it and actually pleased with my success. And those moments were actually kind of an epiphany for me because it was a confidence builder that the person who was put down all of his life and denigrated realized, hey, I've got some smarts, I can handle things. So months later, we had returned to San Diego. We were going through what was called refresher training to go back to depart for a fresh 8-month Pacific deployment. And I got a call from the captain. He called me down and he said, well, Bob, I've got some bad news and I've got some very bad news. I said, okay, what's the bad news? He said, well, the navigator got himself transferred. The very bad news, I was the navigator. Suddenly, here was that city street kid who literally ranked something like 599 out of 600 in the navigation course at Navy OCS, was now responsible. We were leaving in 3 days, navigating a 450-foot ship across the Pacific and all over parts of Southeast Asia. Not surprisingly, it was a very lonely feeling. And I found that I needed more than a manual or friendly advice from people who I realized knew less than me. But more unconsciously than consciously, I think that's when I began to contemplate and seek strength from elsewhere. It was a 7 or 8 month, I forget which, perpetually difficult, always responsible, stressful, exhausting, and relentless deployment. Our involvement in the goings-on there was extensive, and I was compelled always to respond quickly and accurately. Amidst all of this, as I did my job, doing my part to keep the ship, the crew, and several times hundreds of Marines safe during many difficult situations in the right place at the right time, it was a lot, I gradually began to feel that I was getting help from someplace. There are moments in which I am convinced, even today, where my strength, my acumen, and my ability was more than supplemented. There were times I actually felt lifted up. My eyes and mind were now, for the first time, becoming open to the possibility of a something else. Not only the events with which I was occupied, but the magical physical world that I'd been thrust into. Where was I? I was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean much of the time. I was seeing sea life. I was seeing other people. But for example, just for a kid who had, I'm not sure I'd ever even seen the ocean before I was floating around on it, but seeing the smokestack of a ship, okay, and the rest not being visible because of the curvature of the earth. Or if a ship is coming towards you, how the ship would gradually bow first, appear to climb over the horizon. Things that graphically, almost unavoidably reminded one of what we all know as our miraculous and infinitesimally small planetary existence. This, while also on many nights being carried into the breathtaking majesty of a carpet of stars, while in a vast ocean. Incidentally, the stars off of which I navigated and which were always where they were supposed to be and told me where we were in a trackless ocean. So these and many more compelled me to see and contemplate the wonder of all the miracles with which we are surrounded. It was the divine, the incomprehensible, the miraculous that always, always surrounds us. So, as things went along, the Vietnam War was winding down. The ship I was on was decommissioned. So I was looking forward to another appointment someplace else. They said, "No, you're going home." I said, "Well, I don't want to go home." And they said, "Yeah, you are." That was it. So I was sent home about 10 months early. I had by then begun a healing, learning, and understanding process. But typical of a person with my still existing emotional construction, without reflection, I returned to the scene of the crime. I should have gone in the other direction. But there I was, back to the same mental set and back within reach of the monumentally toxic elder sibling. I had readily and still unknowingly stepped back into my foreordained place and role. I began a working life and without real forethought or intent, slid into a pattern of moving from job to job. Remember I said it never was it, never pleased, always kind of angry and barely succeeding. Though truly unaware, I had descended into and was living and not functioning well in a state of depression. However, everything wasn't amiss and good things happened. I did have the great and amazing good fortune along the way of meeting, excuse me, meeting my incredible wife, Susan. But as time went along, she and eventually our 3 children, with whom we were enormously blessed, found themselves living with a person who was deeply depressed and not functioning well, and whose lives were more than negatively affected as well, obviously. Susan's faith in me did sometimes waver, and not surprisingly, for a time became tenuous, but I'm eternally grateful and thankful that she persisted. I had suppressed much of my past, but was being dominated by it. I went through my 20s and 30s robotically bringing home a paycheck most of the time, but rarely ever thinking about my past and still not knowing its tentacles had me in its grasp. Fortunately, my children, and Susan's responsible for a lot of this, or most of it, were bright and active, and some of their friends' parents became our friends. One of them, who's a Baptist minister, who honestly, in hindsight, whose piety at first I found off-putting. But he gradually became a close and dear friend whose visible, always visible, tangible, and unquestioning faith I understood only a little, but whose firm belief in the Christian message and faith I found myself beginning to admire and then actually envy. Okay. Another individual who was a brilliant engineer and a research science displayed a similar Christianity, which described him, his lifestyle and worldview. It was always evident and visible. He was someone, as he sought to learn and understand scientific mysteries, rather than weakening his faith, was finding and unraveling miracles that strengthened his faith. Someone else said this, but when I heard it, I decided it so applied to him. The deeper he delved into the complexities of our world, the better able he was to see and understand the mind of God. Both of these men are gone now. But what I learned from those associations gave me the notion I was seeking something else, something they had, something I wanted in my life, a gift that they unknowingly gave me and I still cherish. My eyes and my heart were opening, but where do we go from here? Susan joined a Methodist church down the street, and I wasn't crazy about the thought then, but I'm grateful now. She also brought our children as well. I went rarely, was not attracted to it, and began to feel in a general sense that for me, it was feeling something like a WASP version of my Sicilian city street. In my mindset, I became convinced that it was a place I didn't belong and should avoid, a place where I perceived, correctly or not, that I was seen as not belonging. So that was all in my brain. That's, again, reacting to things as I always got in the habit of reacting. Now, as it happened, I did get to know some angry and dispirited Methodist ministers, which fed and increased my resistance as well as my cynicism. But it didn't offer an avenue to my continued spiritual growth. But now I was a seeker. We were beginning to think of looking elsewhere for churches for a lot of reasons. In the early 1980s, by happenstance, we walked into the doors of this downtown church called DUPC as they were dedicating their new organ. Susan found it very interesting and decided to attend to see what it was like. After several weeks, she was beginning to contemplate joining and began urging me to try attending with her. I resisted, but she insisted that it was different and that I would be welcomed and I would like it. So early on one Sunday morning, that I had finally agreed grudgingly to accompany her. And as it happened, both of us, fans of Robert Frost, had been discussing his famous poem, The Road Less Traveled. We talked about how that particular poem, which so interested us and so affected me. So we finished our coffee and drove to this place called Downtown United Presbyterian Church, and still anticipating a poorly spent Sunday morning and going only to please Susan, I walked in and sat down, looking forward only to leaving. The minister preaching that morning was one David Romick. The theme of his sermon that morning, The Road Less Traveled by Robert Frost. That was a moment for me. I've had many in my life. I call that a God moment. I've never let go of the thought that that was the message. As Reverend Romick continued, I was kind of floored. I felt kind of exposed, but I also was saying to myself, how did he know? How did that happen? But also, I felt here is someone I felt I wouldn't need to explain myself to. It took me a while to begin to consider myself as a possible member here, but I gradually began to look forward to being here every Sunday. Susan, our 3 children, and I were welcomed, and the people here, by their presence, you folks, their actions, their beliefs, displayed what was to me a profoundly different and welcome understanding of the Christian message. Through the years, I've listened to so many wonderful sermons. I appreciated them, I learned from them, was given a great many insights and understandings, and was often elevated by them. It was a major contribution to the spiritual grounding, which has allowed me to step into the light of both mental health and spiritual growth. Way more than that, way more. however, has resulted from my association with the people who for 40 plus years have made up the life, the soul, and the body of this church. They/you have been my real spiritual mentors. I've experienced unconditional friendship, acceptance amidst people who interpret Christianity as love, acceptance for others, and acceptance of this little sacred planet on which we tumble through the universe. The hallmarks of this place have always warmed me and resonated with me. We believe in caring, sharing, nurturing, fairness, and justice. All of that undergirded by a foundation of understanding, empathy, and compassion. The last 40 years of my associations here have been a period of instruction, learning, and growth, and have opened insights into the meaning of the Gospels and the Christian truths because they are visible and demonstrated here. Now, in conclusion, this might be a little surprising, kind of perversely. I thought it was perverse at first, but no longer. I can now look at my difficult beginnings as a kind of a gift. Okay? Who I am now comes from that life journey that led to a faith journey that shaped me. It didn't destroy me, but ultimately made me the person and soul that otherwise would not have been with you this morning. Also, that I am who I am today, I believe is what was intended. The body and mind do keep score. And each step of the way, each trauma inevitably and permanently changes a person. One does not heal. You don't heal, but one adapts because growing and life continue, but necessarily with an altered and not random trajectory. So I live with gratitude and the certainty that my life as it happened has been a necessary foundation of my present, in which I am filled with enormous blessings and intertwined with and held up by the mysteries, the magic, the miraculous, and the eternal, the comfort and the assurance of God. And that is my brief history, and thank you very much for listening.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Questions for this wonderful history? Like my eyes.
Thank you for your profound honesty in dealing with what you dealt with. Thank you so very much, Bob. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you. I want to elaborate something that's it's a thought near and dear to my mind, but Susan bought me a book, which unfortunately I have yet to read, that is entitled The Body Keeps Score, written by a psychologist. But it's something with which I've been aware for a long time. And I can tell you a very brief story. I may have told it to some of you in the past, I'm not sure, but it seems at the end of World War II in Europe, a man, a little bit of history, a man whose father had served in World War II in the trenches, decided that the war was over, those trenches still existed, and he wanted to go see them. So he found a guide to take him to the still existing World War I trenches in northern France. And he got there, was looking around, and one of his first thoughts was, what's wrong with all the trees? And the guy said, well, of course, World War I had only ended 25 years prior. So it was relatively recent. And the man said, well, during the fighting here, the fighting was so intense, the tops of all the trees were blown off. But they continued to grow. Were they the same? They were not. But the life force continued. They would never be the trees that God intended when God planted that seed. But they would continue to grow, but they were forever changed. And we can extrapolate that notion. It's sad, but it's reality that a lot of people in our society now are really being seriously buffeted. They are experiencing trauma. That trauma will transmit into the future. They are changed. A survivor of the Holocaust, we now know their DNA actually changed. Certainly my DNA was changed. So trauma, when it's inflicted, and I wish politicians would pay close attention to that, reverberates not only through the days and months, it reverberates through the years. And society is the worst because of it. So that's my little thought about trauma. I've experienced a lot of it. I've seen a lot of people who also had trauma in their lives. Teaching in a city high school, you're picking up the pieces from trauma every day. So, okay.
So I had a teaching career also. And when I came into the church in 91, I'm a crier, you know that. Bob was my helper. He helped me stay centered because there's many forces that want you to become conservative and just harsh. I can't describe it as any other way. It was like you're supposed to treat young adults. I was a college teacher. As, potential factory workers and managers and just little automatons. That's how I felt about what I was doing as a college teacher. And Bob kept me from that. He kept me human. He kept me understanding that people have hearts. And that's what we're trying to grow, their hearts.
Well, I'm honored for you to have said that. Thank you, Pat.
And I'm just going to make a quick comment as well, and then Sam, from the chat, just to share, from Carolyn, Bob, your journey is such a story of hope to me. You have been surrounded by a support system that you have been open to for the past 40 years. May we all be open to that support. And then also from Bob, what a privilege to hear this. Profound, rich in wisdom, love, humor, and wonderful you-ness. Sorry. What a blessing you are to us. And Marie had a question. Have you thought of writing your memoir, Bob?
That is something Susan has urged me to do many, many times, and I've given it some thoughts. I have had an interesting life. It truly hasn't been an easy life. But in hindsight, as I said, I wouldn't trade any of it because it created the me that I am today. I've given it some thought. Yes, I've given it some thought. Sam?
I was struck by your story about being in the service, going through OCS, being on ship and being promoted, and then being the terrific experience you had as a navigator, and that obviously that had a big influence on you. And then when you got to the point where you said you had to leave and you were left 10 months early,
Right.
was it possible to have continued in the Navy to create a career, or no?
No.
And what what other alternatives were you thinking of in that time? And you were based out of California. Were
Right.
you thinking of possibly staying in California, or were you always wanting to go back home to Rochester?
Well, those are two good questions. As far as the Navy was concerned, when I graduated from OCS, as did everybody else I graduated with, you're a reserve officer. So if you're a reserve, you serve at the sufferance of the President of the United States. I was told a number of times by people, you have to go regular. The guy I worked directly for was an Annapolis graduate. He was a regular officer. But the reason he was on my ship was he had served his 6-month responsibility and turned in his resignation, and the Navy/president refused to recognize the resignation. So they kept him another couple of years, which they had the right to do under the contract in which he existed. So I had people telling me, Bob, don't go regular because then you lose control of your life. So I didn't. Whether I would have been able to do that, I've never known. I've often regretted it. But would I have remained? I don't know. They had me, you laugh about this, they had me programmed to go to Little Creek, Virginia to learn how to drive a boat, where I would have gone back to Vietnam to drive a boat. I probably would have gotten killed, but I was saying, hey, I'm going to be my own skipper. Well, holy smokes. But when they turned me loose, I had no choice. I was going home. And that was the end of it. And the last part of your question, Sam, was about what? About,
Why you might not have.
yeah, it's interesting. I guess if you were a psychologist, you would understand why I did what I did. It's taken me a long time to understand it. I think if I'd done the mentally healthy thing, I wouldn't have come any closer to New York State than California. I wouldn't have come near the place, really and truly. It was the wrong place for me to be. But when somebody like me has a lot of unfinished business, and remember, I'd emphasize the fact that I still was that person, that subordinate, dominated, denigrated person that belonged in that role. And I really, in my mind, could not imagine doing otherwise. So it didn't occur to me to stay in California then. I've often regretted not doing that. I've often joked with Susan. We went once, we were a guest ship at the mouth of the Columbia River I laugh about it, the Astoria, Oregon Regatta and Fish Festival in 1968. And I was treated like a movie star. There's a little town, I look pretty good in my whites. And I always told Susan I should have stayed in Astoria, but I do also think I came back to meet that woman sitting in front of us right now. She's been amazing. Yes, Elaine.
Thank you. So as a retired social worker, I'm just wondering about your relationships with your siblings, and especially the oldest, and if there was ever healing involved.
That's a good question. That sibling has been deceased since 1990. And the way I speak about him is highly negative, but he's still a sibling, and I did love him. But needed to be away from him. So there has been healing in the sense that there has been perspective. And it's like another botanical illustration I could give you is if you cut a big branch off of a tree, you always see where the stump was, but the way it heals around it sometimes? That's sort of what it is. You get healing on top of it, but it doesn't go away. It just doesn't go away. And it is interesting. I gave this illustration to Dave Lee a while back. Your brain is like a hard drive. In other words, it contains all of this information, and you've forgotten that 90% of it is there, but if you hit the right prompt, boom, there it is. And I joke with Susan, but it's literally the truth. I can describe some of the, I'm 81. I can describe some of these scenes to a point where I can remember what people wore. Okay, it's that vivid in one's mind. You can't erase that. It doesn't erase. I try to suppress it. Okay, but suppression does not work because it's still there. And it's like trying to hold down steam in a boiling pot. It's going to come up sooner or later. So it's more growth than healing, I think. That might be a more appropriate term. I'm sure in your working life you came across tons of stuff. But yeah, and I know I'm not unique. There's a lot of people that go through trauma like that of various kinds. And the key thing I learned raising kids and being a teacher and being a Boy Scout leader and things like that is, boy, when you say things to kids, be careful what you say because they remember. They remember invariably. I went to a.
Oh, Bob.
We running out of time? Okay, go ahead.
I'm afraid so. But this will lead to many other conversations with you, one-to-one, I think. And
Of course.
and I'm sure we're all grateful about your sharing today.
Well, thank you. You're well, and very honestly, I did this because I know I'm among friends here. Like I did say, the bigger an audience I have when I'm talking about history, the happier I am. I woke up this morning and I said, uh-oh, am I really going to do this? But thank you all so much for listening. It's been a joy talking to you.
And we don't have long to get down to worship at 11. But next week we'll do hearing about the spiritual journey of Thomas Merton. Some of you may have read his best-selling book, Seven Story Mountain, from years ago. But he is a very remarkable monk who broke boundaries by getting out into the world at times. And our presenter will be a sister of St. Joseph, Dr. Monica Weiss, who is one of the leading experts on him, I believe. And her talk will be briefly structured around landscape, and she has a number of illustrations to go along with the talk. And I think you'll find it enlightening and quite interesting. And I'll send out more information about both Thomas Merton to whet your appetite and about Dr. Weiss.
Off.